jet with 25 people on board crashed in Colorado Springs today.
Nothing was left to say.
If you flew inside America in the 70s, you probably rode one. The 737-200 had long, thin engines slung close under the wing and a noise you could hear from the parking lot. Americans stopped seeing them by the 90s. Then they began to come down in places where nobody was watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. A week before Colorado Springs, a United crew climbing out of Denver felt the rudder swing on its own. The nose slid 10 degrees to the right and came back before the first officer could react. They pulled the yaw damper circuit breaker and wrote it up, and maintenance replaced the coupler. 2 days later, a different crew reported it worse. The airplane was passing 25,000 feet when the rudder pushed right and held there for several seconds. The write-up said the rudder was moving for no apparent reason. Maintenance replaced the rudder transfer valve, and the system checked out fine. When the airplane pushed back at Denver on the 3rd of March 1991, there were no open items in the log. It was a Boeing 737-200, built in 1982 and delivered new to Frontier Airlines. United bought it from Frontier in 1986. A fresh crew took it over at Denver Stapleton for the last leg. Captain Harold Green was 52 and had been with United since 1969. Other pilots described a man who briefed every approach even in clear weather and told first officers he had no problem with an early go-around. This was his last trip before a 2-week vacation. First Officer Patricia Eidson was 42 and among the first women United hired to fly the line. She volunteered for the trip the night before and did not know who the captain would be when she took it. 20 passengers boarded for the 23-minute hop to Colorado Springs. The crew took the automated weather 40 minutes stale. It gave gusts to 35 knots and a standing advisory for low-level wind shear, so they added 20 knots to their approach speed. The tower passed along what a 737 ahead of them had found on the same approach. 15 knots lost at 500 feet, then 20 gained at 150. Eidson answered that it sounded adventurous. The last thing she said on the radio was that they would hold short of runway 30 after landing. Green was flying. About 40 seconds out, he brought the thrust back, and the airplane began to sink faster than the approach called for, and he pushed the power up again. Eidson called 1,000 feet. Then the airplane began to turn right at nearly twice the rate of a normal turn and kept turning. More than 60 witnesses watched from the neighborhood below. Most said the wings came level for a moment as the airplane lined up with the runway, and then the right wing dropped and never stopped dropping. The roll carried it through 90 degrees and passed inverted until the nose was pointed almost straight down, and the airspeed passed 200 knots. Green called for 15 degrees of flaps, the setting a pilot reaches for when he is going around. 9 seconds passed between the start of the roll and the ground. The airplane hit Widefield Park, a suburban green space with a playground and a disc golf course, 3.5 miles short of the runway. The crater measured 39 feet by 24 and went down 15 feet. All 25 people aboard died. Houses and apartment blocks stood around the edge of the park on every side. The investigation took 10 years, the longest in the agency's history. The first suspect was the wind, because Colorado Springs is known for rotors, columns of air that spin off the mountains like sideways tornadoes. The recorded data would not support one strong enough to do this. The pilots had done nothing wrong that anyone could find. The rudder power control unit was the obvious remaining candidate, and it had been destroyed in the impact. In December 1992, the board published a final report with no cause. Then, in September 1994, a US Air 737-300 rolled left on approach to Pittsburgh and went into the ground, killing 132 people. That unit survived. Investigators supercooled its servo valve and fed it hot hydraulic fluid. A valve jammed in the wrong position did not lock the rudder in place. It drove the rudder the opposite way from the pedals. Green and Eidson had been steering the airplane into the ground with the controls they were using to save it. The board reissued the Flight 585 report in March 2001 and named the valve. Boeing paid to redesign it and replace it across the world fleet, while arguing publicly that the failure was impossible and that the wind had brought the airplane down. Gail Dunham, the captain's widow, spent those 10 years pushing for the amended report. A 13-month-old boy sat on his mother's lap in the cabin, on his way to meet his grandparents for the first time. Flight 204 left Lima at 24 minutes past 2 on the 23rd of August 2005, headed over the Andes toward Pucallpa, on the edge of the Amazon, and then on to Iquitos, 53 minutes in the air. The airplane was a Boeing 737-200 that had rolled out of Renton in August 1981 and gone straight to South African Airways. TANS Peru had it on lease from a South African company for 2 months when the accident happened, with nearly 50,000 hours on the airframe. TANS was owned by the Peruvian state and flown largely by Air Force personnel, and its radio call sign was Jungle Air. It had lost 6 aircraft in 13 years. 98 people were aboard, 11 of them American, and 8 more from Italy and Brazil and elsewhere in South America. The crew planned a visual approach to runway 02. Ahead of them, a cold front was building over the jungle with cloud tops near 45,000 feet, and the storm arrived over Pucallpa in the minutes while they were descending. Passengers felt the airplane start to move roughly about 10 minutes before they were due to land. The hail came next. It hit hard enough that people in the cabin could hear it over the engines, and the rain took the visibility down to nothing. The crew flew the last 32 seconds inside it, descending toward an airport they could no longer see, below minimum safe altitude, still looking for the runway. Investigators later found no fault with the engines, the flight controls, or the ground proximity warning system. What they found was a training program that had given the pilots almost no simulator time with a storm in it. Wind shear pushed the airplane toward the ground about 4 miles short of the field. It clipped the tops of the trees, came down in swamp, and broke in two, tearing a scar through the jungle 100 feet wide and nearly a mile long. Fire took hold at the front of the wreck within 90 seconds. A flight attendant worked the rear of the airplane, getting people moving toward the break in the fuselage. Passengers pulled other passengers out of seats. 58 people got out of 98. They waded away through knee-deep mud in a hailstorm, some of them badly burned, and stood in the rain watching the fire from a distance. The nearest help was a jungle city with limited medical facilities and no straightforward road to the crash site. Locals reached the wreck before the authorities did, and while some of them worked to pull people clear, others were already stripping the airplane for anything they could sell as scrap. Villagers set up alongside the crowd and sold food and drinks to it, while soldiers stood and watched, and the site stayed unsecured for days. Peru's president told the country that afternoon that 20 or 30 people had lived. The airline announced 57 survivors, 31 bodies, and 10 people unaccounted for. The real figure took days to settle at 40. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered on the 25th. The flight data recorder was gone, taken from the wreck by somebody in the crowd, and it came back on the 31st only after the authorities offered $500 for its return. Both boxes went to Washington for reading because Peru had no laboratory that could do it. Peru's Accident Commission spent 312 days on the investigation and found nothing wrong with the airplane. It put the cause on the crew for continuing a visual approach into a thunderstorm instead of following the procedures written for exactly that weather. Hail damage to the engines was raised as a possible factor. 2 years earlier, another TANS airplane had flown into a mountain in the Amazon and killed everyone aboard. After Pucallpa, the government wound the airline down, and TANS stopped carrying passengers in 2006. The load sheet said 62 passengers were seated in the front of the cabin. The front of that cabin held 54 seats. Nobody caught it, and the airplane was cleared to fly. 2 years earlier, a retired Cubana captain had written to Cuban aviation authorities about the same Mexican charter company, warning that its crews were flying without proper procedure. In 2010, and again in 2013, Guyanese regulators had grounded the company's airplanes over overloaded baggage holds and false paperwork. Cubana kept hiring them anyway, because Cubana had almost nothing left to fly. The state airline had been pulling its own aircraft out of service for months over maintenance it could not complete, and it blamed the American trade embargo for the parts it could not buy. On the 18th of May 2018, the airplane sitting on the ramp at Jose Marti International belonged to Aerolíneas Damoy of Mexico City, trading as Global Air. It was a Boeing 737-200, built in August 1979, with 69,000 hours and 70,000 landings behind it. The lease ran 4 days, and this was the last one. 107 passengers boarded for the eastbound run to Holguin, most of them Cubans going home. Among them were a 19-year-old woman and her husband, married 2 months, who had come to Havana to finish some paperwork. The captain was 53 with more than 16,000 hours. The first officer was 40 and had 2,300, and he was the one flying. Every number in front of them was off. The airplane weighed 4,000 pounds more than the paperwork claimed, mostly because of fuel nobody had counted, and the cargo figures did not match what was in the holds either. The seating error moved the calculated center of gravity to 17% when the real figure was 28.5%. That gap set the stabilizer trim to 5 3/4 units instead of 3 1/4, and it put the takeoff speeds several knots below where they belonged. At 8 minutes past noon, the airplane rolled down runway. Everything felt normal through the takeoff run. The crew had worked every checklist. The main gear left the concrete, and the airplane immediately began to roll right. At 85 feet, the right wing was down 33 degrees, and the nose had climbed 27 degrees above the horizon. The first officer turned the wheel hard left and pushed left rudder, and it worked. The wings came level, then passed level to 13 degrees left, and the nose came down to 16 degrees. For a few seconds, the airplane was flying again. Then it rolled right a second time, 12 degrees per second, and the airspeed was bleeding away. The captain took the controls and the first officer let go. By now, the airplane was too slow for its spoilers to bite, and the right wing hung down and stayed there. The nose went up past 25 degrees, the speed fell below 122 knots, and the wing stopped flying. It rolled hard left to 39 degrees, then hard right to 72, and came down in a farm field beyond the airport perimeter. 35 seconds had passed since the wheels left the ground. The airplane clipped a house, went through trees and a railway line, and burned in a cassava field 12 miles south of Havana. Investigators pulled apart everything mechanical they could find. Both engines had been running normally, and the flaps were where the crew had set them, and the tests cleared the rudder, the ailerons, the spoilers, and the fuel system in turn. The only anomaly in the whole airframe was a rudder control bar that had snapped on impact. 3 women reached the hospital alive, and 2 of them died within the week. The one who lived was Mylan Diaz Almaguer, the 19-year-old from Holguin. Her spine and pelvis were broken, one leg was crushed, and she had burns across much of her body. Her husband did not survive. Surgeons kept her alive through months of operations and took the leg. The Cuban Commission published its findings in September 2019 and put the accident on human error, pointing at the weight and balance mistakes and at the training the crew had never received. Global Air had been asked for its training records. What it sent back was incomplete, and investigators noted they could not verify that either pilot had ever practiced recovering an airliner from an unusual attitude. Mexico suspended the company within days of the crash, and it never flew again. Mylan Diaz Almaguer boarded an airplane again in 2021 on a trip abroad and posted the photograph. In September 2025, she enrolled in a theology degree at the Methodist Seminary in Havana. Every 18th of May, she puts up pictures of her husband with a hashtag that translates as "forbidden to forget." Resolute Bay sits near the top of the Canadian Arctic on Cornwallis Island in the territory of Nunavut. Roughly 200 people live there, about 600 miles from the North Pole. The village has a gravel airstrip and no road linking it to the rest of the country, so everything it eats arrives by air. On the 20th of August 2011, the owner of the local inn had chartered a First Air Boeing 737-200 out of Yellowknife to bring up food and supplies. His 2 granddaughters were riding along, age 7 and 6. The airplane was a combi, with cargo pallets filling the forward 2/3 of the cabin, and 4 rows of passenger seats behind them. 11 passengers boarded, and 4 crew brought the total to 15. That same week, the military was running its annual Arctic exercise out of Resolute Bay. The scenario for 2011 was a simulated mid-air collision between 2 airliners, so temporary radar and firefighting facilities had been trucked into an airport that normally has neither. Near the magnetic pole, a compass does not behave. The pole sat close to Resolute Bay in 2011, close enough that pilots working the region had to keep resetting their compasses against GPS to hold them pointed at true north. The crew did this on entering northern airspace and did it badly, leaving the reading 8 degrees off. As the flight went on, magnetic drift pushed the error out to 16. They started down too late against a strong tailwind and arrived high and fast. The captain gave an abbreviated approach briefing and left out the minimum descent altitude. Cloud over the field was moving between 1,500 feet and 200 feet. The autopilot picked up the localizer and started its turn onto the runway heading. Somewhere in the middle of the landing checklist, the captain nudged the control column hard enough to kick the autopilot's roll channel out of localizer tracking and into manual. A few lights went out and a knob clicked to a different position. Neither pilot saw it. The airplane rolled out 3 degrees right of the runway, and with nothing holding it there, the wind began carrying it further off. Because of the compass error, the display in front of the captain read 330, which is to the left of the runway heading. He read that as the autopilot swinging back to recapture the localizer after an overshoot. The flight director agreed with him, because the flight director was reading the same broken compass. The first officer was watching different instruments. His course indicator showed them drifting away from the localizer rather than toward it, and when he checked the GPS, it said the same thing. Over 17 seconds, he told the captain 5 separate times that they were too far right. The captain acknowledged each one and kept flying, because he already knew about the deviation and believed they were correcting it. The needle on the course indicator was pegged at 2 dots, the furthest it can show. The first officer mentioned that there was a hill beside the runway. He asked whether they had done something wrong, then suggested climbing away and circling to sort it out, without ever using the word go around. At 1,000 feet, the approach failed every criterion for stability, and the rules required a missed approach. The first officer said they were 3 miles out and not configured, and the captain heard that as an instruction to finish configuring. Down at the airport, the military tower controller had lost his radar display, so nobody on the ground was watching the airplane drift. They had already passed the threshold and were flying alongside the runway when the first officer used the captain's first name and said he did not like this. 1 second later, the ground proximity warning called sink rate, and he called for a go-around. The captain pushed the throttles up, and the airplane hit the slope of the hill east of the field at more than 200 kilometers an hour. It slid over the crest and came apart across the gravel, the floor tearing out from under the cabin, the wing section burning where it stopped. 12 of the 15 aboard were lost, among them all 4 crew and the younger of the 2 sisters. One of the 3 survivors was a 23-year-old graduate student named Nicole Williamson, who stayed conscious through the entire crash and ended up on the tundra still strapped into her seat with a crushed foot and a broken pelvis. The clouds lifted around 20 past 12 and people at the airport saw smoke on the hill. The rescue that reached them was the exercise. The firefighters, the helicopter, the field hospital, and the trauma teams were all sitting in Resolute Bay, waiting to practice on a fake plane crash 2 days later. Doctors said afterward that a couple more hours in the open would have changed the outcome. The first officer had been trained that he could take the airplane only if the captain was incapacitated or ignored 2 warnings outright. This captain acknowledged every warning he was given. The cargo in the hold had been meat, bread, and vegetables for the inn. It lay scattered across the tundra around the wreck for days, and guards had to be posted to keep the polar bears off it. Copa had bought its 737 secondhand from 7 different airlines: Britannia, Lufthansa, Air New Zealand, Gulf Air, Malaysia, Thai, and others, built across 15 years of production, each one delivered to a customer with its own ideas about how a cockpit should be laid out. By 1992, the airline was flying 5 different instrument configurations, and a pilot moving between 2 Copa airplanes could find the same emergency called for 2 different switch positions. The airplane that flew to Cali on the 6th of June 1992 had come from Britannia Airways and still wore Britannia stripes with Copa titles painted over them. It left Tucumán at 8:30 in the evening with 40 passengers and 7 crew and turned east to go around a wall of thunderstorms sitting over the Gulf of Panama. The controller told them other traffic was deviating north. They asked for a left turn instead and got it, then climbed to 25,000 feet because their requested level was occupied. At 12 minutes to 9, they reported level, and that was the last anyone heard from them. Deep inside the #1 vertical gyroscope, a single wire in the roll synchronizer winding had been pinched against the iron core during manufacture and sealed under epoxy. It had been sitting in there since 1980, through 12 years of maintenance at Britannia and then at Copa, without ever showing up as a fault. That night it shorted, and the captain's attitude indicator froze. An attitude indicator is the artificial horizon, the instrument that tells a pilot which way is up when there is nothing outside to look at. Over the Darien at night, under an overcast, that was the situation in both cockpit windows. A warning light came on comparing the 2 pilots' indicators and finding them in disagreement. The correct response was to check both against the small standby horizon in the middle of the panel, work out which of the 2 main instruments was lying, and switch both displays to the good one. What the crew did instead was select both on vertical gyro 1. That killed the warning light, because there was nothing left to compare. It also fed the broken gyroscope to both pilots at once. Copa's simulator was configured with an auxiliary gyroscope, a third source that some airplanes in the fleet carried, and the drill the pilots had practiced was to switch to the auxiliary. This airplane had no auxiliary. On this airplane, that same switch movement threw away the one good gyroscope they had. The airplane began a right roll to 23 degrees, then rolled back toward level and stopped 4 degrees right wing down. The indicator in front of the flying pilot showed 37 degrees of left bank and held there. He rolled right to correct it. The airplane obeyed him, and the instrument did not move, so he rolled further right. The recorder shows the airplane responding to every input, while the display in front of him stayed frozen. 30 seconds later, the indicator jumped to 117 degrees right, catching up all at once with an airplane that was now past vertical. The nose fell through the horizon, and the speed built. The descent rate reached 49,000 feet per minute. Below 10,000 feet, the airframe came apart. The wingtips tore off and were found 70 feet from each other, 300 feet east of the main wreckage. The cockpit separated whole and landed 5,000 feet from the wing box with its clock stopped at 9 minutes past 9. The flight data recorder's last entry has the airplane at 486 knots. The controller lost radar contact and waited 7 minutes before saying so, because losing returns out there was normal. He asked an Aero Air crew to try raising them, then called Colombia. Villagers in the Darien saw a ball of fire falling with sparks coming off it and heard nothing at all, and told investigators the sky was clear and full of stars where they were. Search aircraft found the wreckage the next morning on a forested hillside near Tucuti. All 47 were gone. Investigators sent parts to the FBI laboratory and found no trace of explosives. They eliminated decompression and the weather and the engines, then worked their way through 20 separate components at Boeing, Honeywell, Collins, and Parker before the pinched wire turned up in a re-examination in 1994, 2 years after the crash. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered almost undamaged. Its tape was broken, and the last thing on it was a flight from 9 days earlier. The airplane had been flying for over a week with a recorder that recorded nothing, and nobody had checked. Because of that, investigators never learned which pilot was flying, what the two men said to each other about the instrument, or whether either of them looked at the standby horizon in the middle of the panel. That instrument was found in working order. Panama's recommendations to Copa began with a suggestion that the airline test the voice recorder once a day before the first flight, as part of the checklist. In July 2004, Mandala Airlines emailed Boeing with a question about the manuals they were flying with. Every page carried a stamp reading, "Do not use for flight," and Mandala wanted to know what that meant. Boeing replied that these were generic copies sent as a courtesy, that they did not apply to Mandala's airplanes, and that they were not intended for operational use. Boeing offered to quote for proper customized manuals. Mandala acknowledged the email and left it there. 14 months later, on the 5th of September 2005, a Mandala Boeing 737-200 sat at Polonia Airport in Medan, waiting for a gap in the traffic. It was the crew's second trip of the day, back to Jakarta on a route they had flown that morning. The airplane was built in 1981 and had 51,000 hours on it, with 112 passengers and 5 crew aboard. Weight and balance were fine, 3 kilograms under what the captain had asked for. Polonia was busy. The tower held them short of runway 23 for about 3 minutes, while 2 arrivals came in, and the report notes that this was more than enough time to run the before takeoff checklist. Whether they ran it is the one thing nobody can answer. The flap item on that checklist has a physical shape. The pilot flying asks for flaps. The other pilot moves the handle and reads the item. Then both of them look at the indicator and the green lights, and the pilot flying says aloud what he sees. If the flaps had been selected and the system had failed, the lights would have stayed dark and the needle would have sat at 0, and both men would have been staring at it. The flaps and slats were retracted when the airplane began its takeoff roll. 6 of the 8 flap jack screws were recovered from the wreckage and measured. For a flaps, one setting, the nominal reading is 4 to 5 inches. The screws measured between 4/10 of an inch and 1 1/3. The slat tracks that survived were jammed fully retracted. Acceleration down the runway was normal, matching the previous takeoff from the same airport almost exactly. Then the nose came up. Boeing's simulation, run afterward against the recorder data, showed the airplane lifting off and continuing to pitch up through 22 degrees. At that angle, the wing stopped flying. The airplane came back down and struck the runway tail first, leaving a silver scrape 36 meters long near the end of the pavement. In the grass beyond it were main gear tracks pressed into the ground with the nose still held high. It lifted briefly a second time, came down again, took out 6 approach lights, crossed a river and hit buildings and vehicles, before stopping on a public road 540 meters past the runway. The left engine had swallowed part of an approach light structure at full power, and investigators later found yellow paint from the light on its fan blades. The takeoff configuration warning on a 737 sounds continuously when the throttles come up with the flaps stowed, and there are 3 separate sensors feeding it, any one of which will trigger it alone. The stick shaker should also have been running the whole time the airplane was off the ground. Neither sound is on the recording. The cockpit area microphone channel was badly degraded by electrical hum, probably an open ground in its wiring, so the investigation could not say whether the horn stayed silent or whether it sounded, and the recorder failed to capture it. Beyond the runway lay a dense residential neighborhood on Jaman Ginting Road. About 30 houses were destroyed along with cars and motorcycles. 49 people on the ground died and 26 were seriously hurt. The tower could not tell anyone exactly where the crash was because the airport's grid map covered only the area inside the perimeter. The fire brigade drove to the end of runway 23 and found the wreck outside the fence with no access road to reach it. They turned around, went back to the apron, and set off again through the city streets with a command car, a fire truck, and some ambulances, leaving the rest behind so the airport could keep a minimum firefighting capability. The roads were jammed with people heading toward the smoke. It took them 25 minutes. Local residents got there first. Some of them found one of the pilots alive in his seat and tried to pull him free and could not work out how to release his harness. Fire came up behind them, and they ran. When it was put out, the seat was burnt through, and the man was gone. 17 passengers survived, nearly all of them from the rear of the cabin. The Bureau wrote that more of them would have lived if help had arrived sooner. The tower at Abuja told the crew about the wind 4 times and nobody asked it to. It was the 29th of October 2006, and rain had just passed over the field. Flight 53 had come up from Lagos and was continuing north to Sokoto. Ground staff got off, the doors closed, and at 11:15, the crew called for start. The airplane was a Boeing 737-200, delivered new to U.S. Air in October 1983 and flown for years by Metrojet before ADC bought it in 2003. At 21 minutes past the hour, they were cleared to taxi to runway 22, and the captain asked for the wind. 210 variable at 8 knots. A moment later, the tower called again unprompted with southerly at 35. The crew acknowledged it and said nothing else. Half a minute after that, the tower called a third time with 28 knots, and this time, the controller added that it was gusty, sir. The crew answered, yes, sir. They asked for takeoff and were told the wind was southwesterly at 15. The captain read it back and then asked the controller to confirm. Sitting on the apron on the same frequency was Virgin Nigeria Flight 042. Its pilot pressed his transmit button and said that it looked more like 35 knots to him. Then he said he would wait for the weather to improve, and he did. The recording shows the ADC crew heard all of it. On the cockpit voice recorder, the captain briefed his first officer that there was wind shear in the area before they rolled. They took the runway at 29 minutes past 11 with a right turn on course, and when the tower handed them to approach control, there was no answer from the cockpit. What the flight data recorder held was thin, so few parameters that investigators had to reconstruct the angle of attack and the wind components mathematically before they could see anything. What the numbers showed was a headwind that became a tailwind. The airplane lost the airspeed it was climbing on, and the crew handled it badly. Recovery had been possible. They stalled the airplane instead, from a height that gave them nothing to work with. 76 seconds after the wheels left the runway, it hit a cornfield about 400 meters past the upwind end and half a mile right of centerline. The ground marks show it came down nose low in an extreme left bank. The crash happened out of sight of the tower and the apron both. The airport radar was switched off that day, so when approach control could not raise the flight, there was no screen to check and no last known position to work from. Controllers asked Virgin Nigeria and a Tradewings flight to try calling, then Kano and Lagos were brought in to try as well. The wreck was burning 400 meters from the end of their own runway, and it took time to find it. When rescuers reached the site, the only section still recognizable as part of an airplane was the tail. A flight attendant and 8 passengers were in it, and all 9 came out alive. 96 others died, and a farmer working the field was struck by flying debris. The Sultan of Sokoto was on board with his son, a serving senator. Sokoto's deputy governor and a second senator were aboard as well. The Bureau put the accident on the decision to take off in weather the crew already knew about, and on their failure to fly the wind shear recovery correctly. It also found that ADC's simulator training for that recovery had been carried out on the wrong equipment, and that the airline had no written procedures for operating in bad weather at all. During the encounter itself, the 2 pilots worked against each other rather than to any standard division of duties. On the radar, the report stated plainly that more people would have survived had it been running. ADC Airlines was suspended and never flew again. Nigeria had lost 3 airliners in 12 months by then. The country rewrote its aviation oversight, retired airplanes over a certain age, and went 6 years without another major crash. Nolanor Aviation flies out of Quebec and operates 8 Boeing 737-200s, which makes it the largest operator of the type left anywhere. In the summer of 2025, it bought another one, an airframe built in 1981, and it expects to buy more. The airline also keeps the only working 737-200 flight simulator on Earth because there is nowhere else to train the crews. The reason comes down to a piece of equipment called a gravel kit, a deflector on the nose gear and vortex dissipators on the engine inlets, fitted at the factory so the airplane can work off dirt and ice. Boeing never certified another jet to do it, and nobody has built one since. In northern Canada, where permafrost makes paved runways expensive and roads impossible, that capability has no replacement. 12 of these airplanes are still active across 4 Canadian carriers, hauling passengers and freight into settlements that are otherwise reachable by boat for a few weeks a year. The 7 airplanes in this video all began in the same building, Boeing's plant at Renton, Washington, between 1979 and 1983. U.S. Air ordered one. So did Piedmont, Frontier, Britannia, and South African Airways. Each flew a decade or so for the airline that paid for it, on routes in America or Europe. And each was eventually sold on to somebody who needed a cheap jet and did not need it to be new. After that, they turn up in Panama and Peru and Indonesia and Cuba, and above the ice at Resolute Bay. What ended them had almost nothing in common. A servo valve inside a rudder unit that jammed and drove the pedals backward. A load sheet that seated 62 passengers in a cabin with 54 seats up front. An autopilot channel that switched itself off near a magnetic pole that was already lying to the compass. A single wire pinched against an iron core during manufacture in 1980 and sealed under epoxy, which waited 12 years to fail. A visual approach flown into an Amazon hailstorm. A takeoff into wind that the tower in Nigeria had called out 4 separate times, and flaps that were never put down. 4 of those airlines are gone now. Peru wound down TANs the year after Pucallpa, and ADC was suspended within weeks of Abuja and never carried another passenger. Mexico shut Global Air after Havana. Mandala went under in 2011, came back under new owners, and closed for good in 2014. First Air merged into Canadian North. The airframe outlasted most of the companies that operated it. The airplane itself was designed in the mid-1960s with a single rudder panel and a single actuator, which is a decision Boeing spent the 1990s paying to undo across the entire world fleet. It came with instrument layouts that changed from customer to customer, and that is what put the Copa flight into the Darien. It has a takeoff warning horn that the crew in Medan may or may not have heard. These are old ideas about how an airplane should be built, and they stayed in service far longer than anyone at Renton was planning for. Resolute Bay still sits at 74 degrees north with about 200 permanent residents and no road out. Everything the village eats arrives by air, on a gravel strip from the south. The jets that land there now are 737-200s with gravel kits. Most of them are older than the one that came down on the hill in 2011. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.